In Bath's glittering pump room, grief stands where music once lived. A widowed duke hears a quiet scale and turns to see a young tutor with the face of his dead wife. Whispers sharpen like knives. A locket flickers with forbidden initials. Duty demands distance. Desire demands courage. One look unseals a past buried in ledgers and fever wards, and a choice rises: honor the shadow or risk everything for the living heart before him. Welcome to a romance of second chances, class and scandal, and love taught one note at a time. Tell me where you're listening from, and answer this. What do you treasure most in period romances, duty or desire? Bath, England. February of the year 1856. The morning fog still clung to the Georgian facades of Bath like a silk veil, softening the edges of chimneys, balconies and carriage wheels that clattered faintly in the distance. Inside the famed pump room, where gentlemen sipped mineral waters and ladies paraded in quiet defiance of sorrow and age, a strange hush hovered in the air. The season had not yet begun in earnest, and yet the atmosphere was unusually tense, as if a note had been struck and not allowed to fade. Duke Edmund Rothbury stood near the marble column that flanked the main gallery, tall and impeccably composed in a dark frock coat. The light from the upper windows caught in the threads of silver at his temples. He had arrived earlier than customary, summoned not by social obligation, but by habit. A habit formed in grief, refined in silence. It had been 3 years since Eleanor, his beloved wife, had passed away during the brutal spring fever, and though time moved forward with the grace of a pendulum, it did not console. It merely counted the days since the world lost its colour. He had taken to walking the colonnades at the same hour each morning, declining invitations, evading conversation, and retreating to his inner exile. But that morning, something shifted. It was the sound, soft and deliberate, of piano keys drifting from the smaller west parlour beyond the main hall. Not a performance, no, it was a study in scales, a measured progression, cautious and warm, as if the musician were coaxing memory from the instrument rather than merely playing notes. Edmund, who rarely noticed anything beyond the veil of his own mind, turned his head and saw her. She sat with her back mostly to the doorway, seated at the square piano positioned beneath the tall sash window. The morning light spilled across her shoulders, catching in the soft chestnut brown of her hair, drawn back in a modest bun with a twist at the side, an elegant simplicity that imitated neither fashion nor neglect. Her posture was poised, her fingers precise. A child stood beside her, a boy of 11 with pale curls and a tentative gaze, Tobias. She turned slightly to correct his hand position, and that was when Edmund saw her profile. The room tilted, the line of her jaw, the slope of her nose, the gentle arch of her brow, every feature echoed Eleanor's so hauntingly that for one breathless moment Edmund believed the dead had returned. But no, this woman was younger, softer, and very much alive. Her skin had the pale bloom of porcelain. Her eyes, though turned away, glinted with that same curious shade of storm sky grey that Eleanor once possessed. He did not move, did not speak. Something ancient and aching clutched at his chest like a phantom hand. "Edmund?" came a voice at his side, low and sharp with concern. Lady Helena Whitcomb, his sister, had appeared as silently as a reprimand. Her dark auburn hair was hidden beneath a smart bonnet trimmed in jet ribbon, her emerald silk pelisse buttoned tightly against the lingering cold. "She's new," she murmured, her eyes narrowing. "Is that Tobias's new instructor?" He could not answer. He feared that if he did, the illusion would vanish. Lady Helena stepped forward, curious, but he stopped her with a gentle motion of his hand. The music had ceased. The young woman smiled faintly at Tobias and murmured something the boy nodded to. Then she stood, and her full profile came into view. The resemblance was not only unsettling, it was devastating. As she gathered her sheet music, Mrs. Eugenia Bramhall entered from the adjoining card-room with the swift rustle of expensive silk and superior judgment. "Well, well," she said, loud enough for all the nearby ears. "So that's the girl, is it? The music tutor with a face from the grave." Helena bristled. "Do lower your voice, Eugenia." "I shall not. The resemblance is uncanny." She tilted her head and lowered her voice to a conspiratorial hush. She walked in wearing a dead woman's face, and no one thought to warn the poor Duke. Edmund had not moved. He stared as the girl, Faith Everly, he now remembered the name, gathered her music folder and stepped toward the exit, oblivious to the ripples she had just cast into every heart in the room. When she passed the column where he stood half hidden, she did not look at him, yet a shiver passed through her, visible in the way she adjusted the shawl at her shoulders, as if some instinct warned her of being watched by someone whose heart she unknowingly held in her hands. And still she kept walking. When she disappeared beyond the doorway, Edmund exhaled, slowly, painfully, as if the act itself threatened to undo him. He finally turned to his sister, his voice a ragged whisper barely audible through the stillness. "Did you see her?" Helena did not reply, because yes, she had. The pale February sun filtered through the tall windows of Ashcombe Hall, casting muted shafts of light across the polished oak floors of the music room. The scent of beeswax and fading roses lingered faintly in the air, and though the fire crackled in the hearth, the room still carried the chill of long silence. In the corner, against a backdrop of burgundy damask drapery, stood a grand square piano with a lacquered finish that gleamed like obsidian. It had not been played in earnest since the last spring Eleanor lived. Now it was occupied. Faith Everly sat with her back straight, her gloved hands resting lightly on the ivory keys. Tobias Marlowe stood at her side, hesitant, eyes darting between her hands and the sheet music propped before him. The boy's fair curls were neatly combed, his grey wool suit buttoned to the throat, but the nervous tremor in his fingers betrayed the storm within him. "Just the first scale," Faith said softly, her voice low and warm. "There's no judgment in music, only patience." Tobias looked at her as if no one had ever told him that before. He nodded and lifted his hands. The notes were uneven, some hesitant, others loud, but Faith did not flinch. She counted gently under her breath, and when he faltered, she merely smiled and adjusted his posture with the lightest touch, her fingers brushing his sleeve like the flutter of a silk ribbon. From the doorway, Edmund watched in silence. He had not intended to attend the lesson. In truth, he had wandered into the West Wing by accident, or so he told himself. But now he stood just beyond the threshold, half shielded by a column, his breath catching in his throat. She was not Eleanor. And yet, the slope of her neck, the softness of her features, the way she tilted her head when listening, these were ghosts stitched into her every gesture. Her voice had a different timbre, a lower, soothing cadence that differed from Eleanor's lilting brightness, yet it unsettled him all the same. The resemblance was not precise, but it was enough to awaken memories long locked behind the iron gates of mourning. On the far wall behind the piano hung a portrait that refused to be ignored. Duchess Eleanor Rothbury, captured in oil and immortal dignity, sat in a high-backed chair, her hands folded over a closed book of sonnets. Her gaze met the room, directly, unwavering, dignified. The artist had captured her in a moment of stillness, yet there was motion in her eyes, as if she were about to speak. She wore a lavender silk gown with lace at the sleeves and a thin gold chain at her throat, one Edmund had given her on their first anniversary. Now that portrait watched every note Tobias played beneath it. The staff whispered. Edmund had heard them the day before, near the stairwell. "She's the very image of her grace," one maid had said. "A trick of the light," another had replied. "Still, it gives me chills." Maybe the Duke sees it too. Why else would he linger? Faith, however, seemed unaware, or perhaps she chose not to notice. She conducted the lesson with grace, never once drawing attention to herself, always turning Tobias back toward the music, toward calm, toward confidence. By the second repetition of the scale, the boy was already playing more steadily. "I want you to think of each note as a breath," Faith said, her hand hovering above the keys. "Let it rise and fall naturally. Don't fight it." As Tobias tried again, she reached into her satchel to retrieve a practice sheet, and in that moment, the small silver chain at her neck caught on the edge of her glove. Her locket slipped free. It fell open. Faith gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She stood swiftly, face flushing as she tried to conceal it, but Edmund had already stepped into the room. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I beg your pardon," Faith said quickly, snapping the locket shut and pressing it to her bodice. "It's just something from my childhood. I didn't mean to cause any disruption." "You did not," Edmund said. His voice was low, steady, but his heart thundered like hooves on frost-hardened earth. "May I—" He gestured toward the locket, then stopped himself. It was not proper to ask, not of a lady, even one in service. Faith hesitated. Then, in a quiet act of trust, she offered it to him, the chain slipping across her fingers with the faint sound of metal on fabric. Her hands trembled. The locket was modest, made of worn silver. He opened it delicately. Inside, a folded scrap of paper yellowed by time rested behind the glass. Upon it were faintly inked initials, ECR, scrawled in a hand he recognized with a jolt of memory. Edmund felt the air leave his lungs. Eleanor Catherine Rothbury. Beside the initials was a tiny note, barely legible. "Comb down, March, nurse's fee secured." He closed the locket slowly. "Where did you come by this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Faith lowered her eyes. "I don't know. I've had it for as long as I can remember. I was told it was found with me when I was left at the church steps in Bristol. I must have been 2 or 3 years old. I don't recall anything before that. And the name—" "There was no name," she said quietly. "The bookseller who raised me gave me the name Faith." Edmund returned the locket. His fingers brushed hers in the exchange, and something passed between them, unseen but felt. A spark, or perhaps a tremor, from some deeper ground shifting quietly below the surface. "You may keep it," he murmured, then turned to Tobias, who had frozen by the piano. "Continue with your lesson." With a graceful nod, Faith returned to the bench and smoothed her skirt, though a faint rose lingered on her cheeks. Tobias sat beside her again, and the music resumed. Slow, uncertain, but real. Edmund walked away, not toward the front of the house, but to the east wing, to the library Eleanor once used for her charitable work. Dust clung to the volumes now, though the room remained untouched, preserved like a reliquary. He lit a lamp and pulled open a drawer in the desk, rummaging through ledgers bound in green cloth until he found the right one. Eleanor's handwriting had always been precise, angled, controlled. She had kept records of every donation, every fee paid to a nurse, every parcel sent to the sick during those dreadful springs. He flipped through the entries until he found it. March 1852. Nurse's fee. Comb down. Infant in care. ECR. Beside it, written in the margin in her hand, "The child at Comb down weighs on me. If anything should happen." The rest was smudged, water-blurred, perhaps a teardrop from Eleanor's own eyes. Edmund closed the ledger slowly, his hand resting atop it as if it were the chest of someone whose heartbeat had long since ceased. Outside, the wind stirred the hedges, and in the music room, beneath the gaze of a portrait, a child played his scales while a woman with a hidden past turned each note into something closer to hope. Ashcombe Hall had always known how to hold its breath. Built with solemnity and stone, it bore its memories in silence, carved into its cornices, whispered through its stairwells, sealed behind the thick velvet of its draperies. Even laughter, when it came, never echoed loudly. It lingered cautiously, as if afraid to overstay. Lady Helena Whitcomb stood in the threshold of the morning room, her gloved hands clasped tightly before her. Her gaze fixed not on the embroidery resting on the table beside her chair, but on the arched window overlooking the east garden, where the frost still clung to the hedgerows and the breath of the earth had not yet warmed. She had always considered herself a woman of formidable clarity, unmoved by sentiment, unshaken by illusion. But that morning, her clarity was a trembling thing. She turned sharply as she heard the soft footfall she had been waiting for. "Edmund," she said, not as a greeting but as a summons. The Duke entered, his hands behind his back, his manner composed but inwardly weary. His cravat was crisply tied, his dark coat immaculate, yet Helena could see the sleepless night etched beneath his eyes, a shadow that had not faded with dawn. "You've been avoiding me," she said plainly. "I've been working," he replied. "Working," she echoed. "You mean searching, digging through Eleanor's papers like a man desperate for absolution." He said nothing. Helena stepped forward, her voice quiet but deliberate. "I saw the way you looked at her, the tutor, Miss Everly." Edmund stiffened. "She is not Eleanor," Helena continued. "You know that. I know that. But you cannot, must not, use her as a mirror for what you lost. Grief has many forms, but self-deception is the cruelest among them." Edmund's jaw tensed. "I do not deceive myself." Helena's eyes narrowed. "Then what do you call standing in doorways like a ghost, watching a girl who carries a locket tied to Eleanor's hand, wearing the face of your memory?" "She is not merely a resemblance," he said, his voice low. "There is more to it than that." "What more?" Helena's voice cracked, just once before she regained control. "You are seeing ghosts in the flesh of a stranger, Edmund. And worse, you are letting Tobias see them too." At the mention of the boy, Edmund's defenses wavered. Helena moved closer. "He is responding to her. That much is true. But if you let him believe she is something she is not, and then take her away when your senses return—" She stopped. "You will break what remains of him." A silence passed between them, thick with memory. Finally, Edmund spoke. "Then question her yourself." Helena's brow arched. "You would let me?" He met her gaze steadily. "She has nothing to hide." Later that day, Helena summoned Miss Faith Everly to her sitting room. The younger woman arrived with calm propriety, her slate-blue day-dress modest, her shawl folded neatly over her shoulders. She carried herself with the kind of dignity that did not seek to impress, but quietly demanded respect. Helena offered her tea, which Faith accepted with gratitude, though she did not touch it. "I hope you understand," Helena began, "that this conversation is not meant as discourtesy. My family has suffered loss. We are protective." Faith nodded. "Of course, my lady. You were taken in by a bookseller." "Yes, Mr. Ambrose Everly of Bristol. He passed 3 years ago." "No family beyond that?" "None that I know of. I was told I was found on the steps of St. Agnes Church, with only the locket and a torn blanket." Helena observed her carefully. There was no pretense in her tone, no false humility, no desperation, just quiet, steady truth. "And the resemblance?" Helena asked. Faith's expression shifted, but she did not falter. "I was not aware of it until I arrived. I've since heard it mentioned, more than once. Does it trouble you?" Faith hesitated. "It makes me careful. I never wished to cause discomfort, least of all to His Grace." Helena studied her for a long moment, then set down her teacup. "You may return to your duties, Miss Everly." Faith stood and offered a respectful curtsy. As she reached the door, Helena's voice stopped her. "You are a fine teacher, Miss Everly. Tobias trusts you." Faith turned slightly. "He is a fine boy, my lady, and I'm honored to teach him." When she had gone, Helena remained seated, hands clasped in her lap, lost in thought. The girl was not a liar. Of that she was sure, and yet something ancient stirred in her chest. A whisper, a memory, a tugging thread from a tapestry she had long believed finished. That afternoon in the music room, Tobias sketched with a piece of charcoal on scrap parchment as Faith played a gentle etude beside him. The fire crackled softly, the scent of cedar and leather curling through the space like a lullaby. "I want to show you something," he said suddenly. Faith turned and leaned in as he held up the page. It was a drawing, crude, as all children's renderings are, but unmistakable. A woman with a delicate face, hair drawn back with side twists, seated at a piano. But the hair, he had shaded it differently. Not in the modest bun Faith always wore, but in the softly coiled style from the portrait above. "She would look nice like this," Tobias said, "like the lady in the picture." Faith's breath caught. She looked up. The portrait of the late Duchess gazed down, serene and severe. "Tobias," she said gently, "This is lovely, but I am not the lady in the portrait." The boy tilted his head. "But you could be." From the doorway, Helena watched the exchange with a strange tightness in her chest. That evening, Edmund stood alone in the study where Eleanor had once kept her ledgers. Candlelight flickered against the spines of books, casting shadows that danced like memories refusing to rest. He opened the cloth-bound volume from the year 1852 and ran his fingers down the familiar columns of donations and allocations. There, in her careful script, was the entry, March 1852, nurse's fee, comb down, infant, ECR. He turned the page. More notations, more references to comb down, to donations to fever wards, to parcels sent anonymously. There was a pattern, a hidden one. She had not merely given funds. She had orchestrated something, protected someone. He retrieved another ledger, then another. Time passed unnoticed. His heart beat louder with each match of name and date, each confirmation that the initials in the locket were not random, not coincidence. Eleanor had not simply given. She had shielded, and what began as grief now spiraled into something deeper, a suspicion that the girl who now sat in his home, teaching his nephew, might be the last thread Eleanor had ever chosen to hold. Upstairs, Helena sat in her room by the fire, the drawing Tobias had made resting on her lap. She stared at it for a long time, then folded it and placed it between the pages of her prayer book. The wind howled softly outside. Ashcombe Hall, always so still, seemed to stir in its bones. Something long buried was rising, quietly, gently, but rising nonetheless. The morning mist lay heavy over the rolling hills that framed the village of Combe Down, shrouding the hedgerows and grey stone cottages in a gauzy stillness. Damp earth clung to the edges of narrow roads, and the scent of lichen and wet bark hung in the air. It was the sort of day in which memories stirred uninvited, rising like breath against cold glass. Soft, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The village stood south of Bath, nestled in a wooded fold, quiet and self-contained, where the trees whispered old secrets, and the past felt as tangible as the cobblestones beneath one's feet. It was here that Edmund Rothbury arrived, seated beside Faith Everleigh in a modest black carriage, drawn by two horses made restless by the scent of rain. They had spoken little during the journey. The official pretense for their visit had been a request from the parish to survey and catalogue local music manuscripts stored in the church vestry, a task to which Faith had agreed with scholarly interest. But both understood, without words, that they were not in search of melodies. They were following a thread, pulled loose from a locket and a line of ink, half erased in a ledger. They were seeking something older than music, something buried in silence and time. Faith sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the fingers of her gloves threaded together like a prayer. She had dressed plainly, in a muted dove-grey gown with a shawl drawn close, but nothing could hide the anxious elegance of her bearing. Her chestnut-brown hair was coiled into its usual low bun, though a few strands had come loose during the ride. She kept her eyes on the passing trees, as if their bare branches might offer answers. Edmund, seated opposite, watched her in quiet contemplation. There was no denying the tension between them, thin as silk, but no less binding. Every glance, every pause in breath, carried the weight of unsaid thoughts. She had begun to inhabit his mind like a memory he had never lived, a woman whose presence disturbed his grief with impossible grace. The carriage turned into the gravel path leading to the parish house, and at once the figure of a woman appeared near the church gate. Agnes Weatherby was in her late 60s, thin as a reed, and wrapped in a brown wool cloak, her boots muddied and her eyes sharp, despite the soft tremor of age in her hands. She had served the village as midwife for nearly 4 decades, and her name had surfaced in one of Eleanor's old notes, scribbled beside a date and a place, Combe Down, March. They were introduced quickly, the formalities quiet and brief. "Miss Everleigh is here on behalf of the Bath Music Guild," Edmund explained. "But I believe you may also recall a moment of some importance to her." Agnes studied Faith for a long time, then nodded slowly. "I've seen that face before," she murmured, "though it was long ago." Faith stiffened slightly. "Where, ma'am?" The midwife gestured toward the parish house. "Best not to speak of it standing in the cold." Inside, the air was warm with the scent of dried herbs and damp peat. A fire crackled in a modest grate. Agnes motioned for them to sit as she poured tea into thick ceramic cups, the silence thick with anticipation. "It was the spring of 1852, she began. The fever had reached the village like a storm. Children took sick by the hour, mothers by the day. We had no beds left, no medicine strong enough, and then she arrived." "Who?" Edmund asked, though he already knew. "A lady," Agnes said simply. "Not one of ours. She came wrapped in a dark cloak, face hidden by a veil, but she spoke with the voice of someone who'd never begged for anything. She carried a child. Said the mother had died in a cottage just beyond the wood. Said she'd paid the nurse and secured shelter. She wouldn't leave until I swore to take the child in." Faith's eyes glistened. "Did she say a name?" Edmund asked. "No, but she wore a ribbon at her throat. Blue-grey, satin, with a pin of gold." Edmund's throat tightened. "And the child?" he asked. Agnes turned to Faith. Brown hair, pale skin, grey eyes, cried like she knew she'd been left behind. Her voice softened. "I wrapped her in a linen blanket and placed a small silver locket on her chest as instructed." Faith pressed her fingers to her mouth. Her breath hitched. "I never knew," she whispered. "I never imagined." "There's more," Agnes said. She pulled a small journal from a drawer beside the hearth. "I kept notes that spring. Not all proper medical entries, just fragments. But here—" She opened the book to a yellowed page. In careful faded script it read, "Lady of Standing. Arrived with child from Stone Cottage. Said to protect her if she did not return. Wore lavender gloves. Left without giving name." Faith closed her eyes. "Lavender." Agnes gave her a long look. "You remind me of her." They left before sunset. Agnes stood at the gate and watched them go with a sadness that clung to the air like smoke. The sky had darkened, and the wind began to rise. By the time their carriage creaked its way through the hills again, the rain had begun in earnest. It fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof of the carriage, the windows streaked with rivulets that distorted the world outside. When a sudden crack of thunder startled the horses, the driver pulled to a stop near a small stone chapel nestled between the trees. "We'll need to wait it out, Your Grace," he called. "It'll pass." Edmund stepped down and offered Faith his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing hers in his, the connection brief, but charged with something electric. They entered the chapel together, the door groaning against the wind. Inside, the air was cool and still. Worn pews lined the nave, and a single stained-glass window cast a muted glow over the altar. A row of extinguished candles sat in silence, their wax long melted into the holders. Faith crossed to the far bench and sat, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her. Edmund remained standing, his gaze fixed on the pulpit. "I didn't expect to feel anything," she said softly. "You were brave." "I don't feel brave." She looked up at him. "I feel like I've been walking in someone else's footsteps, wearing someone else's name." He moved toward her, each step deliberate, but when he sat beside her, he left space between them, a space trembling with questions neither knew how to ask. "I don't know who I am," she whispered. "I've spent my life accepting that. But now I wonder if my life has never belonged to me." He turned to her. "It does." Their eyes met. Time slowed. The sound of rain faded to a hush against the stone walls. Outside, the wind still howled, but in that moment, the only sound that mattered was the soft catch of breath between them. He reached for her hand. His fingers brushed hers, and she turned her palm upward, allowing him to hold it. The warmth of his touch seared through her glove, through her skin, down to her very marrow. "Miss Everly," he began, but he stopped. He leaned in, so close she could see the flecks of blue in his eyes, the faint shadow along his jaw. She tilted her face toward him, and for one suspended heartbeat the world leaned with them. But he withdrew. Abruptly. He stood, walked away, the distance sudden and cold. Faith sat frozen. "I'm sorry," he said, not turning. "That was not my place." Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. No, it wasn't. She stood slowly, her hand trembling as it returned to her side. And in that moment, as the rain pressed against the stained glass, Faith understood something painful and irreversible. He had not reached for her. He had reached for a ghost. The city of Bath, with its elegant crescents and honey-coloured stone, had always prided itself on discretion. Its society, polished and mannered, did not shout. It murmured, and in those murmurs, reputations were made or dismantled with the flick of a fan or the clink of a teacup. In the drawing rooms of Queen Square, over card tables and beneath chandeliers, whispers had begun to circulate like perfume, sweet to some, bitter to others. The Duke of Rothbury, widowed and austere, was said to have fallen under the spell of a common music tutor, a young woman of uncertain birth, unchaperoned in noble company, bearing the uncanny visage of the late Duchess. "She's clever, that one," someone said at the assembly rooms. "She's patient," another replied, "and patience is the weapon of the ambitious." But no whisper carried more weight than the one voiced by Mrs. Eugenia Bramhall, widow of a baronet and self-appointed guardian of Bath's moral fabric. Her eyes, sharp as needles, had not missed a single detail since the first day Miss Faith Everley entered the Rothbury household. To her, resemblance was not coincidence. It was design. "Climbing over a corpse," she said one afternoon to Lady Beatrix Sutton, her tone scandalized, though her eyes gleamed. "The poor Duke has lost his senses. She walks the halls wearing his grief like lace." The remark travelled quickly, wrapped in laughter and sealed with feigned concern. At Ashcombe Hall the effect was immediate. Faith noticed it in the way the footmen paused in their steps when she entered a room, in the sudden silence that greeted her presence in the village shops. She saw it in the widened eyes of mothers who had once praised her teaching and now kept their daughters at a cautious distance. Even Tobias, bright and innocent, seemed confused by the stiffness of those around them. Helena, aware of every tremor in the social current, bristled. "She's being hunted," she told Edmund one morning as they walked the corridor overlooking the orchard. "Not for her conduct, there's no fault to find there, but for daring to exist in your shadow." "She has done nothing wrong," Edmund replied, his voice tight. "No, but nor have you done anything right," Helena snapped. "Your silence invites them. Your absence defends her no better than a locked door defends against smoke." Edmund turned sharply. "And what would you have me do? Denounce the city's matrons in their own parlours? I would have you stand beside the girl if you mean to keep her beneath your roof," Helena said coldly. "Or else let her go, and let this farce end." That evening, after pacing the length of his study and rereading the same passage from Eleanor's ledger 3 times without comprehension, Edmund made a decision. He summoned Faith the next morning. She entered with her usual quiet composure, dressed in a soft lavender day dress and a shawl embroidered with small violets. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her expression was calm, but Edmund saw the fatigue behind her eyes, the bruises left by words unspoken in her presence. "I have a favour to ask," he said. She tilted her head gently. "Of course, Your Grace." "There is to be a musical gathering this Friday," he said, eyes fixed on the fire. "A small affair, patrons of the arts. I would like you to attend, as Tobias's instructor." Faith's breath caught faintly. "Is that wise, Your Grace?" He looked at her then, truly looked. "I believe it is necessary." She bowed her head. "Then I will come." The evening of the gathering arrived with a soft rain and streets aglow with gaslight. Ashcombe Hall's drawing room was transformed with candlelight and music stands, the scent of polished wood mingling with lilacs arranged in tall glass vases. Guests arrived in velvet and lace, the men with watch chains glinting beneath their waistcoats, the women with fans fluttering like restless birds. Faith entered through the side corridor, escorted by Helena, who had taken it upon herself to ensure she would not arrive alone. Faith wore a modest evening dress in pale amethyst, with her hair pinned higher than usual and adorned with a simple pearl comb. She looked neither ostentatious nor timid, only composed, dignified. She was given a place beside the piano, where Tobias was to perform a short sonata under her guidance. Whispers began before the first note was played. Mrs. Bramhall arrived fashionably late, dressed in black silk trimmed with jet beads, her expression one of theatrical solemnity. She made no attempt to hide her disapproval. When Faith guided Tobias to the keyboard, silence fell. The boy, nervous but determined, played well, his small fingers dancing with newfound confidence across the keys. The room, if only for a moment, softened, but as applause rose, Mrs. Bramhall's voice cut through it like ice. "How uncanny," she said, with a smile too sharp to be kind. "The child plays beautifully, and his governess. She plays the part of the Duchess so well, I had to remind myself the poor woman was truly dead." A hush fell. Faith stood, her spine straight, her eyes steady. "I do not pretend to be anyone but myself, madam." "But how convenient," Bramhall continued, turning to the crowd, "to be plucked from obscurity with the very face of a duchess. To be drawn into a home, into a heart, that is enough," Helena snapped, rising. But Bramhall pressed on. "It is cruelty, I say, to allow a ghost to be rewritten by a girl with ambitions and no name." Faith did not flinch. She curtsied, deep and graceful. "If my presence offends, I will take my leave." She turned, found Tobias's hand in hers, and led him from the room. Edmund, who had stood paralyzed by the venom he had failed to anticipate, now moved, but too late. The gathering ended in disarray, guests dispersing under murmurs and sidelong glances. Mrs. Bramhall sipped from her wineglass and declared the evening a success. In the corridor outside, Faith released Tobias's hand and knelt before him. "You played wonderfully," she whispered. "You were brave." The boy, eyes glossy with tears, did not speak. He merely hugged her, tight and desperate. Helena found them a moment later. "I should never have brought you here," she said. "Not into this." Faith stood, her hands trembling. "It is not your fault, nor his, but I cannot stay where I am not wanted." "You are wanted," Helena said firmly, "by Tobias, by me." "Not by him," Faith replied quietly, "and certainly not by them." That night she packed her things slowly, her eyes lingering on the sheet music Tobias had left on the table, a duet they had begun just that week. When Edmund came to her room, the door was already open. She stood beside her valise, composed. "You should not have let her speak," she said, not turning. "I know," he replied. "I will remain until the term concludes. I owe Tobias that much. After that—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Downstairs, the music room sat in silence. Tobias, left alone at the piano, placed his small hands on the keys. He played no notes. He simply rested there, tears sliding down his cheeks in silence, as if hoping the music might return on its own. But the only sound in the room was the wind pressing against the windows and the quiet ache of something beautiful beginning to break. The skies over Bath had grown grey again. A low, silent grey. Not the dramatic gloom of a storm, but the soft, unwavering veil of a sky that had forgotten sunlight. In the windows of Ashcombe Hall, the light hung cold, dulled by the weight of the season and the heaviness in its walls. The fire in the hearths crackled without joy, and the air smelled faintly of wax and dusted velvet, of a house that remembered too much. Lady Helena Whitcomb stood in the Duchess's former sitting-room. The door was closed, the curtains drawn. It had been over 3 years since Eleanor's death, and yet the room remained almost untouched. The chaise lounge near the window still bore the pale blue cushion she had favoured. The writing desk, made of rosewood and inlaid with delicate marquetry, had not been opened since the week of the funeral. Helena exhaled slowly as her gloved hand rested on the latch. Her heart beat with an unfamiliar rhythm, as if memory itself had awoken within her chest. She was not a woman inclined to trespass, but something deeper than curiosity had guided her steps there that morning. Perhaps it had been the way Faith had looked when she left the music gathering, so composed, so wounded. Or perhaps it was the image of Tobias at the piano, waiting for a song that never came. With a quiet click, she opened the desk. Inside, neatly arranged, were Eleanor's writing instruments, a bundle of unsent correspondence, and 2 ledgers Helena recognized. one for charitable expenses, the other for household accounts. Beneath these, tucked behind a stack of ribbon-tied notes, was a thin envelope sealed with faded wax. It bore no name on the front, only a line in Eleanor's hand, written in ink now gone to sepia, to the guardian of the child. Helena's breath caught. She sat slowly and broke the seal with trembling fingers. The letter was dated March of 1852, the same month, the same year. She unfolded it carefully, as if fearing the parchment might crumble under the weight of what it carried. If this letter has reached you, then the moment has come. I did what I could. I did not do enough. She was young, too young to bear what she did, and yet she did it without hesitation, without complaint. Her child was born into fear and fever, and the world was not kind to her mother, as it was never kind to any of us who strayed from what was expected. I could not save them both. I took the child. She bore the same cheekbones as mine, the same delicate brow. She was warm and alive in my arms, and she did not cry. I wondered then if she understood, even as a babe, what it meant to be left behind. I left no name, I could not. But I leave this truth: she belongs to us, not in name, not in title, but in blood and in spirit, and in the debt I carry. I owed her mother more than I ever gave. I did not defend her. I did not claim her. I let her fade into silence, because it was easier to obey my duty than to fight for her honor. I swore to protect her child. If you read this, protect her still. Helena read the letter twice, then a third time. Her throat ached. The fire crackled gently beside her, as if unaware of the storm unraveling within her mind. The cheekbones, the brow, the silence of an infant who did not cry. It was faith. It had always been faith, and Eleanor had known. She rose slowly, pressing the letter to her chest. Hours later, Helena found Edmund in the library, seated beside the long windows that overlooked the orchard. He had not moved in some time. His cravat was untied, and his gaze was distant, fixed on a place only memory could see. Without a word, she handed him the letter. He read it in silence, his hands steady, though his face drained of color. When he finished, he closed his eyes. "Who was she?" he asked, though he already knew. Helena sat opposite him. "I don't know her name." But Eleanor did. She wrote that the girl, Faith's mother, was of our family, that she was cast out, that Eleanor did nothing. Edmund leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, the letter hanging from his fingers. "She might be Eleanor's cousin," he murmured, "or half-sister's child. Illegitimate, forgotten." "She is not forgotten," Helena said firmly. "Not anymore." He looked up. His expression was unreadable. "She doesn't want charity," Helena added softly. "She doesn't want to be anyone's burden, or anyone's replacement." "I never saw her that way," he said. Helena tilted her head. "Didn't you?" The question lingered like smoke in the air. That evening, Edmund sat alone in the Duchess's old room. The fire had been lit but left untended. Shadows crawled along the floor, curling into the corners of the room as if reclaiming it. Faith stood at the doorway. She had come to collect a book Tobias had left behind, but when she saw him there, so still, so solitary, she hesitated. He turned at the sound of her steps. Their eyes met. "I know," she said softly. "Lady Helena told me." Edmund rose slowly. "I should have told you myself. You owed me nothing." He crossed the room, but not too near. "You are not here by accident. You were not chosen out of pity. You were always meant to be here." Faith lowered her gaze. "That does not make me less of a question mark in the eyes of this house, in the eyes of its ghosts." He flinched, but did not look away. "I was born in silence," she said, her voice trembling. "Left in the cold, wrapped in linen and rumor, and now I'm supposed to find comfort in knowing I carry the blood of a family that never wanted me." "You carry Eleanor's protection," he said. "I carry her regret." That struck something in him. "You still mean to leave?" he asked. She looked at him then, truly looked. "I must," she whispered. "I need to know who I am without her, without you, without this house and its shadows." He took a breath, but said nothing. "I will stay until the term ends," she continued. "Tobias deserves that." And then, without waiting for a reply, she left. The door closed behind her with a gentle click. Edmund stood in the room Eleanor once claimed, the letter still on the table, the fire burning low. And though he was surrounded by the past, he had never felt the future more uncertain. Winter deepened. The frost no longer arrived in gentle veils, but clung in hardened sheets across the panes of Ashcombe Hall, thick as remorse. Each morning, the lawns sparkled beneath a pale sun that offered no warmth, and the bird-song that once pierced the dawn had stilled, replaced by wind groaning softly beneath the eaves. Faith Everleigh was gone. There had been no dramatic farewell, no last walk through the garden or lingering look in the music room. She had left as she had arrived, quietly, with dignity, her small valise clasped tightly in her hand, her shawl drawn close against the cold. A hired carriage had taken her down the gravel path and into the morning mist, bound for a modest girls' school in Bristol. There, she would instruct the daughters of merchants in simple melodies and proper posture, far from grand estates and haunted portraits. Ashcombe Hall felt the absence like a wound. Tobias retreated first. He no longer touched the piano. He sat in the corner during lessons, offering monosyllabic responses to his new tutor, who was kind but uninspired. The boys' drawings grew darker, the lines heavier. Once he had sketched birds and faces. Now he drew empty chairs and rooms without doors. Lady Helena watched it all unfold with growing steel beneath her sorrow. Her manner, once sharp but fair, turned brittle and distant. She spoke to Edmund only when necessary, and even then her words bore the chill of disappointment. She was never trying to stay, Helena told him one evening as they passed in the corridor. She was trying not to be driven away. Edmund said nothing. He had no defense. Only silence. The music room, once filled with hesitant scales and quiet laughter, now stood empty. The dust gathered quickly, despite the staff's efforts. The piano keys sat untouched, their brightness dulled. Sometimes Helena would find herself standing in the doorway, hands clasped, straining to hear a note that never came. And Edmund unraveled slowly. He no longer dined at regular hours. He took long walks without direction. The ledgers remained unopened, the correspondence unanswered. But at night, when the halls had quieted and even Helena had retreated to her chambers, he sat alone in the library and read Eleanor's journals. Not the public entries, the ones shared with guests and staff, but the private ones, the margins, the half-finished thoughts left scribbled beside recipes and medicinal notes. One passage returned to him again and again. "They think I give for appearance. But the truth is, I give for the ache. I cannot sleep knowing she is alone in that place. If I must wear my sorrow in silk, then so be it. But I will carry her child out with my own hands, and no one will stop me." He read it in the flicker of candlelight, until the words blurred. Then one morning, without warning, Edmund departed. He took only one valet and no coachman, leaving his affairs in the hands of the steward. He said nothing to Helena, only left a brief note. "Gone to the city. I will return when I can." She did not ask where. She already knew. The road to the infirmary in Bath twisted through alleys and climbed slowly uphill, the stone beneath his boots slick with winter dew. The old fever ward still stood, red brick faded to rose, the windows narrow and clouded. Inside, the air was thick with lye and coal smoke. Nurses moved silently, their skirts brushing past iron-framed beds. The scent of broth mingled with antiseptic and sorrow. He found the physician in a side room, now greyed and stooped, his hands marked by age but still steady. "Yes," the man said when Edmund inquired. "I remember her." He poured tea as they sat, his eyes far away. "She arrived at dusk," he said, veiled, soaked from rain, with a nurse beside her and a child wrapped in her arms. Not her child, I realized later, but she held the girl as if she had come from her own body, would not rest until we had found her a bed, would not leave until we took the locket and promised to keep it with the girl. Edmund's throat constricted. The doctor's gaze softened. She was not a woman who acted out of sentiment. She acted out of purpose. There was guilt in her, that much I remember. She kept touching the baby's cheek, whispering something again and again. What did she say? The old man paused. She said, "You will not be forgotten. Not you." There was a silence then, the kind that pressed inward. "Do you recall the child?" Edmund asked. The physician nodded. A chestnut curl had fallen across her face. She cried when we took her, but only once. Then she went quiet, alert, watching us all, like she understood. He looked at Edmund with a frown. "You know her?" "Yes." The man leaned back. "Then you've seen her strength." Edmund walked the halls of the infirmary for the remainder of the afternoon. He passed the convalescents, their eyes dulled by fever and fatigue. He saw the nurses writing names on slates, the children huddled in cots too large for their limbs. It was not a beautiful place. It was a place of necessity, of survival. But it had once been touched by his wife's hands. And it had once saved the girl who had unraveled everything he thought he understood about grief. That night, Edmund returned to Ashcombe and summoned the steward. "I want the hospital's records reviewed," he said. "Their roof is leaking. Their supplies are thin. We'll send what they need, quietly, without announcement." "Yes, Your Grace." Edmund paused, then added, "Have a separate account opened in the Duchess's name." "Of course." The steward left, and Edmund sat once more in the music room. The fire had not been lit in days. The chill bit through his gloves. He crossed to the piano and sat. His fingers hovered above the keys. He did not play, not yet. He simply rested his hands there, as if hoping that by touch alone he might remember how it felt to feel. Upstairs, Tobias dreamed without music. And in Bristol, beneath the low beams of a schoolhouse, Faith taught a girl to play her first notes. Her voice was soft, her hands warm. But her eyes, when she turned away, remained fixed on something only she could see. The air in Bristol was sharper than in Bath, carrying the scent of coal smoke and sea wind. In the narrow courtyard of the girls' school, dried leaves scattered along the stone, caught in the corners where no one bothered to sweep. Within the modest music room, barely wider than a corridor and lit only by a small mullioned window, Faith Everley sat beside a young girl, correcting the girl's finger placement on a cracked wooden keyboard. The child played a few notes, then turned with a question, but Faith's eyes were far away. "Miss Everley?" Faith blinked, smiling gently. "Yes, Charlotte. Try again, from the top of the scale." But the child had already noticed it, that the warmth in her teacher's voice no longer lit her face. That afternoon, as the school bell echoed across the garden, Faith stayed behind in the classroom, straightening the battered sheets of music, the edge of her shawl clutched in her hand. She had grown used to the rhythm of the school, the plain meals, the distant chimes, the polite indifference of the headmistress. Here she had become invisible again, safe. And yet, each night, as she extinguished the lamp by her bedside, she heard the silence where Tobias's laughter once lived, saw the flicker of a fire in a music room now abandoned, and felt the weight of a name never fully spoken. When the knock came on the third afternoon of the week, Faith opened the door, expecting the school porter. It was Lady Helena. She stood alone, a cloak of deep green velvet drawn close at the collar, her face paled from travel and something else, something older, heavier. She removed her gloves slowly, not as a lady entering a room, but as a woman seeking permission to remain. "May I sit?" Helena asked. Faith nodded, though her voice caught in her throat. Helena took a chair by the hearth, resting a small parcel wrapped in linen on her lap. She did not speak immediately. The ticking of the wall clock filled the room in the silence. "I did not come for my brother," Helena said softly. "You must know that." Faith folded her hands in front of her. "Then for whom? For myself, perhaps, but mostly for Tobias." At that name, Faith's resolve faltered. "He asks for you," Helena continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Not once or twice. Every evening before bed he prays aloud for your return. Not to the house, not to the piano, to him." Faith looked down, her lashes dark against her skin. "I told myself I was above such appeals," Helena said. that if you had chosen to leave, it was your right. But the truth is, I've come because I understand now what grief can do to a woman, how it twists our pride into something cruel. I blamed you, Faith, not because you deserved it, but because your presence forced me to face what I had refused to name. She opened the parcel gently, revealing the silver locket and a folded page yellowed at the edges. I brought these, she said, not as bribes, as acknowledgements. You were never a trespasser in our lives. You were always a thread Eleanor left for us to find. Faith reached forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the locket. I can't go back, she whispered. Not if I return as someone's mistake. Helena met her gaze. Then come as Tobias's teacher, as your own woman. And if you must look past Edmund, do so, but do not look past the child who still waits for music. Faith held the locket in her palm for a long time, and then, quietly, she agreed. They returned to Bath under a shroud of fog. Ashcombe Hall loomed familiar and strange, its stone facade unchanged, its gates creaking open without ceremony. But Edmund was not there. The housekeeper informed Helena with a deferent nod. He's gone to the infirmary, my lady, the old fever ward. He's been spending time with the children. Helena turned to Faith. Would you like to go home first? Faith looked toward the frost-laced windows. No, take me to him. They found the chapel behind the hospital, small and unadorned, its walls bare stone and its roof sloping gently. The door, warped by time, opened with effort. Inside, the air was warm from the fire burning in the brazier. And there, before a cracked upright piano in the corner, sat Edmund. His coat was removed, his sleeves rolled, and his head was bowed over the keys. He played slowly, delicately, her melody, the one she had once taught Tobias. The notes lingered in the still air like unanswered questions. Faith did not speak. She stepped forward, one hand against the worn edge of a pew. Edmund turned when he sensed her presence, and for a moment he could not move. Her face, half-shadowed by the low flame, appeared like a memory made flesh. He rose slowly. Miss Everleigh, Faith swallowed. Lady Helena told me where to find you. He nodded. The space between them was thick with emotion, too brittle to touch. I came to see the place, he said at last. Where she brought you. I wanted to know what she gave you before the world did. Faith stepped closer. And did you find it? His eyes held hers. I found that she gave you to yourself, and that I nearly took that away. She closed the last step between them. I won't return to Ashcombe as a reminder, she said, nor as a shadow of her. You must return, he said, his voice trembling, but only as who you are, not who I believed you to be, not who anyone tells you to become. Faith stared at him for a long moment. Then he said her name, gently, reverently. Faith Everleigh. Nothing more, no title, no borrowed past. She exhaled, and in that breath, something shifted. Not absolution, not promise, but the beginning of something neither dared name. In the quiet chapel, beneath the winter light, the last note faded into silence, but neither of them moved. The sun had returned to Bath, though gently, as if unsure of its welcome after such a long and mournful winter. At Ashcombe Hall, the thaw was more than seasonal. It was felt in the lightness of a breeze that moved through the open windows of the east corridor, in the way the servants smiled again as they passed one another in the halls, and in the delicate sound of music returning to the walls that had so long been silent. Faith Everleigh stood alone in the music room. Her hands were folded at her waist, her eyes cast upward to the pale square of empty wall above the piano, where for so long the portrait of the late Duchess had held watchful dominion. The absence was striking. The ornate frame, once home to Eleanor's serene, untouchable gaze, had been removed. In its place only the faint outline of dust remained, a silent testament to what had once been revered and now was respectfully laid to rest. Faith stepped closer. She reached out and touched the bare wall with her gloved fingers, as if to be sure the painting was truly gone. There was no curtain to cover the space, no furniture rearranged to distract from its absence. It had not been concealed, it had been released. Behind her, the soft creak of the door gave her pause. She did not turn immediately. Only when she heard his footsteps cross the room, quiet but purposeful, did she allow herself to breathe. "Miss Everly," Edmund said, his voice gentle, no longer guarded. She turned slowly. He stood near the hearth, dressed in a charcoal coat and ivory cravat, his expression composed but not unreadable. There was no storm in his eyes now, only calm, as if the battle within him had reached its conclusion. "You removed her," Faith said. He followed her gaze to the empty wall. "I did." "Why now?" "Because it was never meant to stand in judgment of you," he replied. "And because I've spent too long trying to live in rooms meant for the dead." Faith lowered her gaze, her throat tightening. "You said once that I was not Eleanor, but sometimes I feared you needed me to be." He stepped toward her. "I did not need you to be her. I only needed to remember how to feel." She said nothing. Edmund drew a breath, not out of hesitation, but as a man preparing himself to speak the truth without armor. "I have been many things since she passed," he began. "A ghost in my own home, a man who loved silence more than comfort. But you returned life to this house, not with thunder, but with patience, with the way you listened, the way you stayed." Her eyes shimmered. "And when you left," he continued, his voice growing rougher with emotion, "I thought I could live with the silence again. But it wasn't silence. It was absence. You weren't a shadow in these halls, Faith. You were the light." Her breath caught. He stepped closer, slowly, his hands loose at his sides. "I cannot promise you grand declarations or perfect answers. I have failed too many times to pretend I deserve your forgiveness. But I have learned," he said, "that grief cannot be buried. It must be honored and then let go. I loved Eleanor. I will always honor what we had. But I choose to live now." He paused. "I choose to live. With you." Faith looked up at him, the tears silent on her cheeks. He did not kneel. He did not need to. He simply extended his hand, open and waiting, not demanding, not pleading. "I do not offer you a title," he said softly. "I offer you my heart, as it is, not as a refuge, but as a home." She reached for him, not immediately, but with a deliberateness that spoke of all she had endured to arrive at this moment. She placed her hand in his, her touch warm, trembling. "There will be conditions," she whispered. He smiled, a trace of humor breaking through the tension. "I suspected as much." "The house," she said, stepping nearer, "must open its doors, as Eleanor once opened them, not only with donations but with shelter, with music, with purpose." Edmund nodded solemnly. "You want it to be more than a sanctuary. I want it to be a beginning." He took her other hand now, and together they stood at the center of the room that had once been a tomb, and now held the quiet promise of life. Above them, the bare wall was no longer a mark of sorrow. It was space made for the future. Neither of them noticed the quiet creak at the stairwell. Lady Helena stood there, one gloved hand at the railing, her eyes shining not with pride or satisfaction, but with something gentler, something softer than apology and stronger than forgiveness. She saw the way Edmund looked at Faith, not as a man who needed saving, but as a man who had chosen someone he did not wish to live without. And she saw the way Faith stood, steady, certain, equal. The tears fell without shame, not for what had been lost, but for what had finally been found. The first breath of spring came early to Somerset that year. It rustled through the awakening trees and stirred the pale green buds along the rose trellises of Ashcombe Hall. The once silent corridors, once echoing only with memory, now pulsed with a gentle kind of music. Laughter in the drawing room, the rustle of small feet across polished floors, and the daily hum of life restored. The hall had changed, though its walls still stood tall and proud. Now children occupied rooms once shuttered. Their voices spilled from wide windows and wandered through the gardens where silence had once made its home. The western wing, once a place of shadowed stillness, now bore the name the Eleanor Rooms, housing both a modest infirmary and a classroom filled with instruments and eager hands. The music school, modest in scale but vast in heart, welcomed children from villages near and far, many orphaned, some recovering from illnesses, all in need of something softer than the world had previously given. At the heart of it stood Faith Everly. She moved through the hall with quiet purpose, her presence as natural as the scent of lavender that drifted through the curtains. She no longer flinched at her reflection in the tall hallway mirrors. She had come to understand that resemblance was not destiny, it was merely the surface of a story far deeper, and her pages were her own. In the central drawing room, transformed now into a recital hall, a small audience had gathered. The spring recital was a simple affair. No chandeliers borrowed from London, no foreign dignitaries, no elaborate display of lineage or wealth. Instead, the audience consisted of friends, villagers, doctors and teachers. Women in modest lace gloves, men with worn hands and eyes made soft by music. Faith stood at the grand piano, sunlight cascading over her shoulders through the arched windows. She wore a gown of soft lavender, its colour chosen by Helena with surprising sentimentality. A thin chain of silver adorned her throat, the locket no longer hidden beneath fabric, but resting gently atop it, no longer a secret, but a symbol. Tobias sat beside her on the bench, taller now, his posture straighter, his fingers confident as they rested over the keys. His eyes searched Faith's face once, and she nodded, smiling. Then they began to play. It was a simple composition. Faith's own arrangement of a melody Tobias had hummed on a rainy day, weeks after she returned. It was filled with pauses and swells, rises and retreats. The notes spoke not only of sound, but of survival, of learning how to breathe again, of knowing when to let another take the lead. Edmund stood at the back of the room, arms folded loosely over his chest, his face illuminated with pride that had no need for words. His eyes remained fixed not only on Tobias or the piano, but on Faith. He watched her hands, her steady posture, the way she glanced at the children with love that asked nothing in return. To see her now, so rooted, so certain, was to understand the difference between sorrow and grace. At the close of the final note, the room remained silent for one suspended moment. Then came the applause, gentle at first, then swelling into something that felt less like appreciation and more like gratitude. Near the front row, Helena dabbed her eyes discreetly. She did not weep easily, but she wept now. And beside her sat midwife Agnes Weatherby, her back more hunched than it had been a year before, her bonnet slightly askew, her gloved hands clasped tightly over her cane. Her eyes did not leave Faith. They shimmered, full of memories she had never thought would find resolution. She had walked through many doors over the course of her life, but none as redemptive as the one that led her here. After the music, guests were invited into the portrait gallery. Children wandered ahead of the adults, their footsteps reverent as they paused before the frames lining the newly refurbished space. At the far end, in the sunlight of a western window, hung a new painting. It was not large, it did not tower or command, but it held a hush around it, as if the walls themselves acknowledged its weight. There sat Faith, painted with masterful restraint by a local artist. She was captured mid-movement, her fingers just lifting from the piano, her face not toward the viewer but slightly turned, as though the melody had drawn her gaze beyond the moment. The lavender dress fell in graceful folds, the light catching at the fabric like a whisper of spring itself. A small plaque beneath read simply, "Faith Everly, Mistress of Music and Light." Nearby, encased in glass beneath a dome of polished crystal, rested two items side by side. The first was the silver locket, still worn, still loved, but now replaced by a replica for daily use. Its initials were visible, no longer mysterious, the chain resting over a velvet pillow. Beside it lay the sealed letter, Eleanor's letter. Its contents were known only to Faith and Helena, and that was enough. It had not been opened again. It remained not as a confession, but as a testament. A record of one woman's final act of courage and love. A small girl with dark curls stood before the case and asked, "Is that the lady who saved the baby?" Helena crouched beside her. "Yes," she said softly. She saved the child, and the child grew strong and kind and brave. "Is that Miss Everly in the picture?" the child whispered. Helena nodded. "It is. She looks like a princess." "She is," Helena said, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. "But not the kind who lives in towers. The kind who builds bridges." Faith stood at the far end of the gallery, watching quietly as the girl and Helena spoke. Her hands were folded before her, her shoulders relaxed. Edmund approached and stood beside her without a word. His presence no longer carried tension, only steadiness. When he reached for her hand, she did not hesitate. The silence between them now was not awkward or strained. It was companionable. A silence that spoke of things that had been endured, of lessons learned in the hardest way, of futures neither of them had dared to dream until they had let go of ghosts. "I'm glad it was today," Faith murmured. "The recital." "Why?" "Because it's exactly 1 year since the music stopped," she said, "and today it began again." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. A gesture so simple and yet so full of reverence it left her breathless. They stood beneath her portrait, sunlight wrapping around them like a benediction. In that moment, Ashcombe Hall was no longer only a house of memories. It was a house of beginnings, and in every note played, in every child's laughter, in every breath drawn without fear, Eleanor lived. Not in the portrait on the wall, but in the choice to love again, to shelter again, to believe again. A new composition had begun, and this time it would be written together. The wind that swept across the meadows of Somerset on the first day of April was neither cold nor urgent. It was the kind of breeze that carried memory gently, like music half-remembered or laughter echoing from a distant room. Ashcombe Hall stood as it always had, stately and serene, but the years had softened its edges. Ivy now grew more freely along the eastern wing, as if embracing the past without shame. The once rigid stone paths had been replaced by winding garden walks, where children's feet wandered as often as adults. And where once only portraits and hush had ruled, there was now the steady rhythm of life, its complications, its comforts, and its quiet victories. The music school had grown. It now housed nearly 40 students, some gifted in their craft, others still learning to place their hands on the keys without trembling. A new wing, modest in name but grand in spirit, bore the inscription, "The Tobias Everly Wing for Musical Healing." Children no longer hid their scars, their coughs, or their pasts. They were met with patience and with song. Faith Everly, now 36, moved through the hall with a grace that no longer came from self-control, but from ease. Her hair was still the colour of polished chestnut, though a few silver strands had begun to appear near her temples, like threads of wisdom carefully stitched into her. She no longer avoided mirrors. She no longer wondered whom she resembled. Her face belonged to herself. On this particular morning, she wore a simple gown of dusky rose, with sleeves rolled to the elbow and ink smudges on her fingers. In the crook of her arm, she carried sheet music, her own composition, now taught to the youngest class. She passed through the music room where years ago a portrait had hung that no longer haunted the space. In its place was a mural, painted by the children, of birds flying over a hill, each one unique, each one in motion. Through the tall windows, laughter rang out from the garden, where 2 small boys chased each other, their dark curls bouncing wildly. One tripped and fell and immediately wailed. Before a nurse could reach him, a taller boy of about 13 dropped his book and knelt at the child's side. "It's only your knee," Tobias said gently, brushing the dirt away. "You're all right." The little one sniffled. "It hurts." "Then come. We'll find your mother." He lifted the boy into his arms, awkward but determined, and began walking toward the house. Faith watched them from the doorway, her heart full. Tobias had grown into his name, into his strength. Though he still played the piano with a soul beyond his years, he had also discovered something new: leadership, gentleness, purpose. He was no longer the boy who clung to silence. He was the young man who offered his voice to those who hadn't yet found their own. When Edmund joined her on the terrace, his steps were slower now, more measured, though no less sure. Time had refined his features, carved new lines into his brow and around his mouth, but his eyes remained the same, grey-blue and steady, full of a love that had only deepened. He pressed a kiss to her cheek. "They're at it again?" "Every day at this hour," Faith said with a smile. "One falls, the other mends. Sounds familiar." They both laughed quietly. Their marriage had not been a fairy tale, but something richer, built not on fantasy, but on truth. There had been sorrow, misunderstandings, seasons of worry and triumph, but through each trial their devotion had endured, not as a fire that burned wildly, but as a hearth that never went out. Their twin sons, Edmund and Elias, were now 7. Mischievous, clever, and fond of peppering the dinner table with questions that no one could quite answer. They bore no title, no pomp, only the quiet dignity of being raised in a home where love was not conditional and music was the first language they had learned. Inside the drawing room, a new display had been added to the glass case. Alongside the sealed letter and the locket, now joined by a child's drawing of Eleanor with wings, sat a new journal. It bore Faith's handwriting on the cover, "To the children who come after, music and memory." Midwife Agnes Weatherby had passed away 3 springs prior, her final days spent in a room filled with music. Faith had stayed with her until the end, and it was Agnes's last request that the children of Ashcombe remember her not with flowers, but with a song. They had written one. They sang it every year. As for Mrs. Bramhall, her name had faded from the lips of society, which had grown weary of her venom. In time, her grand opinions had lost their audience. When she died, it was in a quiet house with no visitors, her final price being that no one wept. Faith sent flowers nonetheless. Helena, ever the watchful sister, had remained at Ashcombe. Over the years, she had become the unofficial dean of the school, stern but beloved. She walked now with a cane and wore spectacles she refused to acknowledge, but her mind remained sharp. Her love for Tobias never wavered, and though she rarely spoke of the past, she never again referred to Eleanor as an angel. Time had taught her that sainthood belonged not to those idealized, but to those who had faced grief and still chosen mercy. That afternoon in the recital hall, the students gathered for the spring performance. The theme was legacy and renewal. Each child played a piece that told the story of someone they admired. One girl played a melody she called The Woman with the Locket. Another boy performed a song he wrote titled Brotherhood, inspired by Tobias and the twins. Faith sat beside Edmund, her fingers woven with his. As the final note faded and the applause rose like a wave of warmth, Edmund leaned close. "I would choose you again," he whispered. Faith turned to him, her voice soft but steady. "I never doubted that." The audience stood, and behind the rows of chairs, the tall windows opened to the garden. The wind carried the scent of lavender and earth, and with it came the sound of children laughing, running, beginning. Ashcombe Hall had endured many chapters: grief, silence, remembrance, but on that day it stood not as a monument to what had been lost, but as a living testament to what had been built. Not a fairy tale, not perfection, but a home. A composition that began in sorrow, deepened in love, and 8 springs later played on. Sometimes healing doesn't come with a thunderclap. It comes quietly, like a melody rediscovered, or a hand reaching back when you thought you were alone. Faith Everly's journey reminds us that love is not measured by perfection, but by resilience, that our past may shape us, but they do not define us, that grief can break us open, yes, but through that very break, something new can grow, something tender, something enduring. In a world where many carry invisible wounds, Ashcombe Hall became a sanctuary, not because it was grand, but because it chose compassion over pride, music over silence, and light over memory's shadows. What did this story awaken in you? If you've walked with Faith and Edmund until this final chapter, we invite you to write the word legacy in the comments. That way, we'll know you were here, heart, soul, and all, and together we can help more people discover this beautiful tale. If this story moved you and you'd like to support the passionate team that brings these historical romances to life, consider sending us super thanks here on YouTube. Whatever you feel comfortable giving, know that it helps keep these stories flowing. And if you're not able to contribute that way, you can still make a huge difference by simply sharing this video with someone who loves stories that touch the heart. We're leaving more timeless romances for you in the cards above. Tales of longing, redemption, and impossible choices. Thank you for joining us, and may your own legacy be written in kindness, courage, and love.